At George Washington's Mount Vernon, the dining table was more than a place to eat. It was where power, politics, and identity came together. Imagine sipping turtle soup beside roasted eel or biting into corn cakes fresh from the hearth while cider poured freely. These weren't random meals. They were statements of wealth, survival, and the birth of a new nation. And hidden in Washington's menu are foods so surprising you'll never look at the first president's dinner table the same way again. 1. Small roasted pig with sides. If you were a guest at Mount Vernon, the sight of a roasted pig arriving at Washington's table would have stopped conversation cold. Whole roasted pig wasn't an everyday meal. It was a centerpiece, a show of abundance and celebration. Imagine the crackling skin, golden from the spit, the tender meat carved and shared piece by piece. Around it, sides of seasonal vegetables, fresh breads, and relishes turned the meal into an event. For Washington, food wasn't just about eating, it was about status and hospitality. A roasted pig told his guests, whether foreign dignitaries or local neighbors, that America's land could provide. It was also practical. A pig could feed dozens at once, and nothing went to waste. From the cheeks to the trotters, everything found its way onto a plate or into a stew pot the next day. Here's where it gets fascinating. In 2025, serving a roasted pig at home would cost you upwards of $250 to $300, depending on size. Back then, it was pennies compared to imported delicacies. The irony? What was once the mark of prosperity is now a rare feast reserved for weddings, luau's, or high-end restaurants. And yet, at Mount Vernon, it wasn't just a meal. It was a statement that this young nation had plenty to give. 2. Boiled leg of lamb with vegetables. Now picture this. Instead of roasting, Washington's cooks often chose to boil a leg of lamb. Sounds simple, almost plain, right? But in the 18th century, boiling was a sign of refinement. It kept the meat tender, juicy, and easy to serve with a medley of vegetables, carrots, turnips, and potatoes simmering in the same pot. The result was a hearty, fragrant dish that warmed guests without being overly heavy. Why lamb? Washington's estate raised sheep not just for wool, but for meat. A boiled leg of lamb showed practicality as much as taste. Unlike pig or beef, lamb was considered a gentler meat, one you could serve to foreign diplomats without overwhelming them. Add in a ladle of broth and a sprinkle of herbs from Mount Vernon's gardens, and you had a dish that blended simplicity with elegance. Here's the kicker. In today's money, a leg of lamb with vegetables for a family might cost around $40 to $50. Back then, it was farm to table in the purest sense. No shipping, no markup, just estate-raised animals feeding estate guests. It's easy to imagine the general himself, spoon in hand, dipping into a bowl of steaming lamb and vegetables after a long day of correspondence. Comforting, filling, and unmistakably homegrown, this was the quiet strength of Mount Vernon's table. 3. Assorted roasted fowl platter. If the pig was the showstopper, the fowl platter was the chorus line, a whole spread of roasted birds laid out together. Picture it. Ducks, pigeons, quail, maybe even a goose or two, each roasted until their skin crisped and their juices ran clear. The smell alone would have filled Mount Vernon's dining room, a mingling of gamey richness and herb smoke. In the 1700s, variety wasn't just luxury, it was power. Serving multiple types of fowl told guests that Washington's estate had reach. His farms and hunters could bring in not just the basics, but delicacies that required time and effort. Smaller birds like quail were tricky to catch, but they were prized for their tenderness. Larger birds, like geese, symbolized festivity. Together, they created a table that looked abundant, colorful, and impressive. Here's the hidden detail. Roasted fowl was often served with sauces, maybe a sharp vinegar reduction or a sweet fruit glaze. Washington's guests weren't just chewing on roasted meat. They were tasting the careful work of enslaved cooks who knew how to elevate simple game into something worthy of a president. Now, think about it in 2025. A spread like this would easily cost $150 or more at a specialty butcher or restaurant. Back then, it was hard work, but it was land and labor, not dollars, that made it possible. This platter wasn't just food, it was Washington's way of saying, "Welcome to my table. This is America's promise." 4. Roast beef with horseradish. Few dishes spoke power in the 18th century like a perfectly roasted beef. At Mount Vernon, a large cut of beef would be slow roasted over open fire, basted with drippings until the outside browned and the inside stayed tender. But what made it truly memorable was the bite of freshly grated horseradish, sharp, fiery, and guaranteed to wake up even the sleepiest guest at Washington's long dinner table. Roast beef wasn't just a meal, it was a tradition carried from England where it symbolized strength and abundance. Washington, ever the statesman, knew the message mattered. When guests cut into that beef, they weren't just eating, they were tasting the stability and resources of a new nation, proving it could feed its own. The horseradish was more than seasoning. It was a jolt, a reminder that American tables could bring bold flavors to match bold ideas. In 2025 terms, a roast like this, a few pounds of quality beef plus fresh horseradish root, would run about $60 to $80 for a family gathering. Back then, it cost Washington almost nothing, since cattle grazed on his land and horseradish grew right in his gardens. Picture the scene: candles flickering, knives carving, plates passed around with steaming slices of beef. Then comes the heat of horseradish that clears the nose and sparks conversation. At Mount Vernon, this wasn't just dinner. It was a declaration that America was rich in both flavor and spirit. 5. Hominy pudding. Now here's a dish that ties Washington's table directly to the New World. Hominy pudding, made from dried corn kernels soaked in lye water, then baked into a custard-like side, was a uniquely American creation. Forget fancy French sauces or English puddings. This was corn, the grain that native peoples had cultivated for centuries, transformed into something rich and filling for the president's guests. Imagine the texture: soft, creamy, a little nutty, with just a hint of sweetness if molasses or sugar was added. Served hot, it was hearty enough to stand alongside roasted meats, yet humble enough to remind everyone that America's bounty grew right out of its soil. For Washington, this dish wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. Corn was the backbone of colonial survival, and by putting it on his table, he was showing pride in America's identity. Here's the kicker. In 2025, hominy is dirt cheap. A can costs under $2, and you could bake a whole pudding for less than $10. But on a modern table, it feels like a rare, old-fashioned treat, something you might stumble upon in southern kitchens or family reunions. At Mount Vernon, though, it was a quiet star. While the roasted meats wowed the eye, the hominy pudding whispered a deeper truth. America's strength came from its land, its people, and its simplest ingredients. 6. Peas pudding with bread. On Washington's table, not every dish was grand or glamorous. Take peas pudding. A thick, savory mash made from dried peas, boiled down until soft, then mixed with a little fat or broth. It was earthy, filling, and often served alongside bread for dipping. To us today, it might sound like poor man's food, but in the 1700s, peas pudding was a staple, a dish that bridged old-world traditions with new-world practicality. Imagine guests spooning the pale green pudding onto their plates, spreading it onto fresh loaves, or eating it as a humble counterpoint to rich meats. The beauty of peas pudding was its versatility. It stretched meals, fed large groups cheaply, and kept bellies full long after the fire burned low. At Mount Vernon, it wasn't just economy at play. Serving peas pudding alongside roasted meats showed balance. Wealth wasn't only in abundance, but in the ability to mix simple and grand on the same table. And it gave enslaved cooks a chance to showcase their resourcefulness, turning dried peas, water, and a pinch of seasoning into something hearty and satisfying. Here's the kicker. In 2025, you could make peas pudding for under $5, feeding a family of 4. Back then, it was even cheaper. Peas were one of the most reliable crops. Yet what makes it powerful isn't the cost, but the symbolism. In a world where freedom and survival clashed daily, peas pudding reminded everyone that strength often comes from the simplest foods. 7. Lettuce and cucumber salad. Among all the heavy meats, puddings, and roasted sides, Mount Vernon's table sometimes offered something surprisingly fresh, a simple lettuce and cucumber salad. Picture crisp green leaves, hand-picked from Washington's gardens, tossed with sliced cucumbers cooled in spring water. Dressed lightly with oil, vinegar, or maybe a hint of herbs, it was a refreshing counterbalance to the richness of roast beef or ham. In the 18th century, salads weren't everyday fare like they are now. Vegetables were seasonal, and serving them raw was considered almost fashionable, a mark of refinement. For Washington's guests, a bright, cooling salad reminded them that Mount Vernon wasn't just a farm, it was an estate that could provide variety. It showed sophistication in a way just as powerful as a platter of roasted fowl. There's also a quiet symbolism here. Washington valued agriculture above almost anything. He once said, "I would rather be on my farm than be emperor of the world." A lettuce and cucumber salad was proof that the land itself was bountiful, capable of giving freshness alongside sustenance. And here's the kicker. In 2025, a salad like this would cost maybe $6 to $7 at the grocery store. At Mount Vernon, it was practically free, picked steps from the kitchen garden. Yet its impact was priceless. In a world of smoke and spice, that cool crunch of cucumber was a reminder of life's simplest pleasures. 8. Artichoke garnish platter. Now here's a dish that spoke of wealth and refinement, the artichoke platter. In the 1700s, artichokes weren't common fare for ordinary Virginians. They were labor-intensive to grow, seasonal, and considered a delicacy brought over from European traditions. To place a platter of artichokes, whether boiled, roasted, or simply arranged as garnish, on Washington's table was to quietly say, "This is no ordinary household." Imagine the scene. Roasted meats piled high, bowls of hominy pudding, and right in the middle, a carefully arranged platter of artichokes. Guests would nibble the tender leaves, dipping them in a butter or vinegar sauce, peeling away until they reached the prized heart. For many, it was as much about the experience as the flavor. Artichokes were exotic, a little mysterious, and they made a strong impression. At Mount Vernon, the presence of artichokes also told a story about Washington's devotion to farming innovation. He experimented with seeds and crops constantly, eager to test what the Virginia soil could yield. Serving artichokes was part luxury, part experiment, proof that even the president's table was rooted in curiosity about the land. Fast forward to 2025, a single fresh artichoke might cost $3 to $4 at the grocery store. Back then, it cost almost nothing if grown at home, but the effort made it priceless. On Washington's table, it wasn't just food, it was a conversation piece, a symbol of sophistication, and a little taste of Europe in a brand new America. 9. Mixed berry crèmes. After plates of roasted meats, hearty puddings, and rich sides, Washington's guests could expect something lighter, sweeter, like mixed berry crèmes. Imagine bowls or cups filled with fresh blackberries, raspberries, and strawberries, blended into a smooth cream custard or layered with whipped cream. It wasn't just dessert, it was elegance in a spoon. In the 18th century, berries were seasonal treasures. At Mount Vernon, enslaved workers gathered them from gardens, orchards, or the surrounding fields. Blending them with cream turned something simple into something refined. The tartness of berries balanced the heaviness of dinner, while the cream added richness that only an estate with dairy cows could easily supply. For guests, this was luxury disguised as simplicity. And here's the quiet brilliance. Berries reminded everyone that America's soil produced fruits as fine as Europe's. Washington didn't need to import exotic delicacies when Virginia's fields offered their own abundance. Mixed berry crèmes were patriotic in their own subtle way, celebrating local harvests while still impressing dignitaries. Now let's translate that to 2025. A dessert like this would cost maybe $15 to $20 at a restaurant, especially if made with farm-fresh cream. But at Mount Vernon, it was practically free. Fresh-picked berries, fresh cream, labor already in place. Yet for all its simplicity, the dish carried weight. After long debates over politics or war stories, guests could settle into something soft, sweet, and comforting. It wasn't just the end of a meal, it was a reminder that even the first president knew the joy of dessert. 10. Fruit tarts selection. If there was one dessert that could steal the spotlight at Mount Vernon, it was the fruit tart platter. Imagine trays of golden pastry shells filled with spiced apples, stewed cherries, or even peaches preserved from the summer harvest. Glazed with a touch of sugar or honey, each tart was bite-sized luxury, sweet enough to close the meal, but light enough to keep guests lingering for more. In the 18th century, tarts were a mark of refinement. They required skill, a steady hand to craft the crust, time to stew fruit to the perfect texture, and a kitchen cool enough to handle delicate pastry. Washington's enslaved cooks mastered this, turning Virginia's orchards and gardens into elegant desserts that rivaled anything from Europe. For foreign dignitaries, fruit tarts sent a message. America wasn't rough or uncultured. It could produce cuisine as polished as any royal court. Here's the kicker. In 2025, a dozen gourmet fruit tarts might cost $30 to $40 at a bakery. But back then, the main expense was labor and time. Fruit came from Mount Vernon's orchards, flour from its mills, butter from its cows. What was priceless was the skill of the cooks who transformed these raw ingredients into something fit for the president's table. And that's the power of the tart. It took the bounty of America's soil and turned it into elegance. Each bite whispered a promise. This young nation could be sweet, sophisticated, and enduring. 11. Iced creams, early ice cream. Now this one will surprise you. George Washington loved iced cream. Yes, early ice cream was already on the president's table in the late 1700s, but it wasn't like the cartons we grab today. At Mount Vernon, iced cream was made by hand, with cream, eggs, sugar, and fruit or vanilla, then churned inside a metal container packed in salt and ice. It was labor-intensive, requiring constant stirring to keep it smooth. But the result? A frozen luxury that dazzled guests. Think about it. In a time before refrigeration, serving ice cream in Virginia's summer heat was nothing short of magical. Washington even invested in ice houses on his estate, where large blocks of winter ice were stored underground for use throughout the year. That meant he could serve iced cream long after other households had melted away their reserves. And the flavors? Early recipes called for strawberries, apricots, or even spiced chocolate. Each scoop was rare, seasonal, and unforgettable. It wasn't just dessert. It was a performance, proof that Mount Vernon's hospitality was on the cutting edge of culinary fashion. Fast forward to 2025. You can pick up a tub of ice cream for $5 to $7. But in Washington's day, iced cream was priceless, a marvel of labor, planning, and innovation. Guests left not just with full bellies, but with stories to tell. I had frozen cream at the president's table. 12. Fresh plums and pears plate. Not every dish at Mount Vernon needed fire or spice. Sometimes Washington let nature do the work. A platter of fresh plums and pears, picked straight from the estate's orchards, often graced his table. Imagine polished silver dishes stacked with ripe fruit, their skins glistening in the candlelight. Guests could pluck a pear, slice into it, and taste the sweetness of Virginia soil, no recipe required. In the 18th century, fruit wasn't just a snack. It was status. To serve ripe plums or pears in abundance meant you had orchards that flourished, workers to tend them, and storage methods to keep them fresh until dinner. Washington's orchards produced more than enough, showing off both his success as a farmer and the richness of American land. And there was symbolism, too. In a world of salted meats and heavy stews, a plate of fruit was refreshment, almost like nature's dessert. It was a reminder that America's identity wasn't built only on imported tastes, but on what its own soil could produce. Now, let's compare. In 2025, a pound of pears or plums runs about $3 to $4. At Mount Vernon, the cost was measured not in money, but in labor and care, pruning, watering, harvesting. Yet that care made the fruit priceless. Imagine biting into a juicy plum after roast beef and pudding. Simple, sweet, and unforgettable. 13. Dried fruit and nut assortment. After a long dinner filled with roasts and puddings, guests at Mount Vernon might linger over something simple but elegant, a spread of dried fruits and nuts. Picture bowls of raisins, figs, and apricots laid out alongside almonds, walnuts, and hazelnuts. No cooking, no sauces, just nature's sweetness and crunch, perfectly preserved for nibbling with wine or cider. In the 18th century, dried fruits and nuts weren't just snacks. They were luxuries. Some came from abroad, figs and almonds often imported from the Mediterranean, while others, like walnuts, were harvested closer to home. To serve them casually after a meal was a subtle display of wealth and global connection. Washington's table wasn't only local, it was worldly. Guests could taste Virginia's harvest alongside flavors carried across the Atlantic. But there was also practicality. Dried fruits lasted months without spoiling, and nuts could be stored all winter long. For a household that entertained often, this assortment was both impressive and useful. It let Washington show refinement while keeping provisions ready year-round. Now compare it to 2025. A tray of mixed dried fruits and nuts might cost $20 to $30 at a grocery store. Back then, it was partly homegrown, partly imported, and entirely a statement. Around the table, laughter and conversation flowed, and the simple act of cracking a walnut or chewing a sweet fig reminded everyone of abundance and of America's place in a bigger, connected world. 14. Mince pie, dessert. No 18th century feast felt complete without a mince pie. At Mount Vernon, this dessert was rich, spiced, and deeply traditional. Imagine a flaky crust filled with minced meat or suet, dried fruits like raisins and currants, flavored with nutmeg, cinnamon, and a splash of brandy. It wasn't the sugary holiday pie we know today. This was a hearty, spiced dish that blurred the line between savory and sweet. Mince pies carried strong ties to English heritage. For Washington, serving one wasn't just about flavor. It was about tradition and respectability. To his guests, the pie whispered continuity. Even as America forged its independence, the table still honored old customs. The warm spices and rich filling also made the dining room smell incredible, a festive finish after platters of roast beef or turkey. What's striking is how symbolic it was. This pie was about memory, the old world meeting the new. At Mount Vernon, it reminded guests that while America was building its own identity, it hadn't forgotten its roots. Now think of it today. In 2025, a homemade mince pie would cost around $15 to $20 in ingredients, especially with dried fruit and spirits. Back then, the most expensive part was the imported spices. But for Washington, the cost was worth it. A slice of mince pie meant more than dessert. It was comfort, culture, and connection to a world America was just learning to step away from. 15. Chess tarts. Sweet, simple, and unmistakably Southern, chess tarts were a favorite at Mount Vernon. Picture small pastry shells filled with a rich custard of eggs, butter, sugar, and a splash of vinegar or lemon juice to cut the sweetness. Baked until golden, the tops formed a delicate sugary crust that cracked with every bite. These little tarts weren't flashy, but they were addictively good, the kind of dessert that disappeared quickly from the table. Chess pies and tarts have deep Virginia roots. They didn't rely on rare spices or imported fruit, just pantry staples that every estate had on hand. That made them reliable crowd pleasers. At Washington's table, chess tarts balanced the elegance of fruit tarts or blancmange with something more local, more homegrown. They showed that sophistication didn't always mean complicated. Sometimes the simplest recipes carried the most charm. Enslaved cooks at Mount Vernon perfected these, their skill turning sugar and eggs into something that could stand proudly beside imported desserts. Guests from Europe might have been impressed by roasted pig or iced cream, but they probably remembered the chess tarts just as fondly. In 2025, you could whip up a dozen chess tarts for under $10. Yet they remain timeless. Sweet, humble, and tied to Southern history, these little bites remind us that even the first president enjoyed desserts that were both simple and unforgettable. 16. Blancmange, creamy dessert. Blancmange might sound fancy, and it was, but at its heart, it was comfort in a bowl. At Mount Vernon, this creamy dessert appeared as a smooth, pale pudding made from milk or cream thickened with gelatin or isinglass, sweetened with sugar, and sometimes flavored with rosewater or almond extract. Once cooled, it set into a delicate mold, often shaped into domes or fluted patterns that looked impressive on the table. To Washington's guests, blancmange wasn't just dessert, it was a statement of refinement. Imported recipes from Europe considered it the height of sophistication. Serving it proved that Mount Vernon's kitchen wasn't only capable of roasting meats and baking pies, it could produce culinary artistry on par with any fashionable household abroad. But beneath the elegance lay symbolism. Blancmange was smooth, pure, almost pristine, a dish that carried associations with gentility and health. Guests might take a spoonful after a heavy meal of roasts and puddings, savoring the cool, light texture as a soothing contrast. Now picture it in 2025. You'd spend maybe $12 to $15 on cream, sugar, and gelatin to recreate this dessert. Back then, the most costly part wasn't the ingredients. It was the labor. Enslaved cooks carefully crafted these molds by hand, turning basic dairy into an artwork that impressed diplomats and neighbors alike. At Washington's table, blancmange wasn't just food. It was a quiet show of grace, proof that even the new American Republic could master the old world's elegance. 17. Spiced cranberries in brandy. Now here's a dish that would have caught the attention of any guest. Spiced cranberries in brandy. Imagine glossy red berries simmered gently with sugar, cinnamon, and cloves, then soaked in a splash of brandy until they gleamed like jewels in a bowl. Sweet, tart, and laced with warmth, it wasn't just a side or garnish. It was a little luxury that brightened the table. Cranberries were one of America's own treasures, harvested from bogs in the northern colonies. By spicing and preserving them in liquor, Washington's cooks turned a seasonal fruit into something that could be served year-round. For guests, this dish carried a double meaning. It showed off America's native bounty, while also proving the household had access to costly imports like sugar and brandy. At Mount Vernon, a spoonful of these spiced cranberries added sparkle to roasted meats or even desserts. They weren't necessary for survival. They were meant to impress, to delight, to remind guests that Mount Vernon blended old-world elegance with new-world flavor. Fast forward to 2025, making a batch might cost $10 to $12 with fresh cranberries and a small bottle of brandy. Back then, cranberries were gathered locally, but sugar and liquor were expensive, making this dish a statement piece. It said, "Here, even the smallest spoonful speaks of abundance." Sweet, tart, spiced, and spirited, spiced cranberries in brandy were more than food. They were Mount Vernon's way of putting a little sparkle on the nation's table. 18. Baked squash with almonds. Amid all the roasts and rich desserts, Mount Vernon's cooks knew how to elevate even the humblest vegetables. Take baked squash with almonds. Picture bright orange squash, sliced and baked until tender, then topped with slivered almonds toasted to a golden crunch. A drizzle of butter or honey might finish it off, turning a simple vegetable into something elegant enough for Washington's table. Squash had deep American roots. Native peoples cultivated it long before Europeans arrived, and by the 1700s it was a staple crop across Virginia. By pairing it with almonds, a prized import, the dish perfectly symbolized the blend of old-world refinement and new-world abundance. It showed that America's fields could hold their own alongside Europe's delicacies. At dinner, baked squash with almonds offered balance. After heavy meats and rich puddings, its sweetness and nutty bite gave guests something lighter, yet still refined. It was also practical. Squash stored well through the winter, making it a reliable ingredient for a household that entertained constantly. In 2025, you could make this dish for under $12. Squash from the farmer's market, almonds from the grocery aisle. But at Mount Vernon, the value wasn't in the cost. It was in the message. America's land could transform even a simple vegetable into a dish worthy of presidents and diplomats. With every bite, guests tasted both the farm's bounty and the chef's artistry. Proof that elegance didn't always come from Europe. Sometimes it sprouted right from American soil. 19. Baked celery with slivered almonds. Here's a dish that might surprise you. Celery wasn't just a crunchy snack in Washington's day. It was considered elegant. At Mount Vernon, celery was often baked until tender, then topped with slivered almonds for a nutty, buttery finish. Imagine stalks arranged neatly in a dish, soft and savory, with almonds giving just the right amount of crunch. In the 18th century, celery was rare enough to be prized. It required careful cultivation, often grown in trenches and blanched, to keep its stalks pale and tender. By serving it baked with almonds, Washington's cooks elevated a simple vegetable into a refined side dish worthy of guests from Europe or high society. It wasn't about filling bellies, it was about refinement and style. What makes this dish fascinating is how it shows the blending of practicality and polish. Celery grew well in Virginia gardens, but pairing it with imported almonds signaled luxury. On Washington's table, it was proof that even vegetables could speak of wealth and sophistication. Now picture it today. In 2025, celery is one of the cheapest items in the grocery aisle. You can grab a bunch for $2. Add almonds, butter, and seasonings, and you might spend $8 total. But back then, it was a showpiece. Guests didn't just taste baked celery. They tasted the future of American cuisine, humble crops dressed in elegance. 20. Candied sweet potatoes. Long before sweet potato casserole made its way onto modern holiday tables, Mount Vernon was serving an early version, candied sweet potatoes. Picture thick slices of golden orange potatoes baked until soft, then glazed with butter, sugar, and maybe a touch of molasses. The edges caramelized, the centers stayed creamy, and every bite struck that perfect balance of earthy sweetness and rich indulgence. Sweet potatoes were more than just food. They were a distinctly American crop, tied to the South and beloved for their versatility. By candying them, Washington's cooks transformed a humble root into something that rivaled the finest European confections. Guests expecting simple boiled vegetables would have been pleasantly surprised when their fork met something closer to dessert. For Washington, this dish carried both practicality and pride. Sweet potatoes, stored well, grew reliably in Virginia soil, and could be dressed up to impress foreign visitors. Serving them candied showed that American ingredients could shine on their own terms, no imports required. Now fast forward to 2025. You can buy a bag of sweet potatoes for $4 to $5, add a stick of butter and some sugar, and feed a whole family for under $10. But in Washington's day, the true cost was the sugar, an imported luxury that turned a simple vegetable into a showpiece. At Mount Vernon, candied sweet potatoes weren't just a side dish. They were proof that America's soil could produce flavors as sweet and sophisticated as any royal feast. 21. Mutton chops with sides. Few dishes spoke to the blend of practicality and tradition at Mount Vernon like mutton chops. Imagine thick, bone-in cuts of sheep, seared over fire until browned, then served alongside simple sides, perhaps stewed carrots, potatoes, or a ladle of rich gravy. The flavor was bold, a little gamier than lamb, and it carried the taste of the Virginia countryside straight onto the plate. Mutton wasn't a delicacy. It was everyday strength food. Washington's estate raised plenty of sheep, primarily for wool, but once they aged out of producing, they became the centerpiece of hearty meals. Unlike roast beef or delicate poultry, mutton had a rugged quality, a taste of the land, honest and filling. For guests, it showed that Mount Vernon's table could offer both sophistication and substance. The sides mattered too. Vegetables from the gardens, breads from the estate's flour, maybe even a mustard sauce for dipping. Together, they turned a farmer's meal into something refined, and because mutton was abundant, it was practical for feeding large gatherings without breaking resources. In 2025, mutton chops aren't as common as beef or pork, but specialty cuts might run $20 to $30 for a family meal. Back then, they were simply part of the farm's natural cycle. Nothing wasted, everything used. At Mount Vernon, mutton chops with sides told a quiet truth. America's first president valued resourcefulness as much as elegance, and he wasn't afraid to serve both at the same table. 22. Cold baked Virginia ham. Now here's a dish that practically defined Southern hospitality: Virginia ham. At Mount Vernon, a whole ham would be cured in salt, smoked for weeks, then baked until rich and savory. But often it was served cold, thinly sliced, as part of a spread for guests who dropped by unexpectedly. Imagine that deep, smoky flavor, cut with a touch of sweetness from a glaze of molasses or brown sugar and laid out on a polished platter. Virginia ham wasn't just food, it was identity. This was a product of the region, famous even in the 1700s, and Washington knew its value as both nourishment and symbol. To serve Virginia ham was to say, "This is what our land produces best." It was sturdy, reliable, and distinctively American, a point of pride for a new nation eager to stand on its own. The cold preparation had another benefit. It lasted. A single baked ham could feed the household for days, with slices finding their way onto breakfast tables, into travel provisions, or alongside bread and cheese for lighter meals. In 2025, a whole cured Virginia ham might cost $80 to $120, depending on the quality. Back then, it was far more accessible, especially for a plantation like Mount Vernon that raised and processed its own hogs. Every slice of cold-baked ham carried weight. It wasn't just a dish, it was a taste of place, a reminder that even without Europe's luxuries, America's own flavors could be world-class. 23. Roast turkey with chestnut stuffing. Few dishes captured the spirit of Mount Vernon quite like roast turkey with chestnut stuffing. Picture a grand bird, browned to perfection, carried into the dining room as the centerpiece of the table. Its skin crisp and glistening, the aroma of roasted herbs filling the air. But the true star was inside. A rich stuffing made with chopped chestnuts, breadcrumbs, butter, onions, and savory spices. Turkey was deeply American. While Europeans boasted their pheasants and partridges, Washington could proudly serve a bird native to the New World. Adding chestnuts elevated it from rustic to refined. Chestnuts were a holiday delicacy, their nutty sweetness blending perfectly with the hearty meat. Together, they created a dish that symbolized both abundance and celebration. For Washington, turkey wasn't just a meal, it was a statement of national pride. To his foreign guests, it said, "We have our own delicacies here, and they rival yours." To his neighbors, it was hospitality at its finest, offering comfort in a form everyone knew and loved. In 2025, a stuffed turkey might run $50 to $70 at the grocery store, especially with chestnuts priced high. At Mount Vernon, the cost was in preparation, not ingredients. Turkeys roamed the land, chestnuts grew in the forests, and enslaved cooks transformed them into culinary art. At that long table, carving into roast turkey with chestnut stuffing was more than dinner. It was a celebration of the land, the season, and the new nation itself. 24. Oyster on the half-shell. If there was one dish that screamed coastal luxury in the 18th century, it was oysters on the half-shell. At Mount Vernon, trays of freshly shucked oysters would arrive on the table, their briny aroma mingling with candle smoke and roasted meats. Served raw with a splash of vinegar or a squeeze of lemon, they were bold, fresh, and unforgettable. Oysters were plentiful in the Chesapeake Bay, making them both accessible and fashionable. Washington loved the bay and knew its bounty well. Serving oysters wasn't just about taste. It was about showcasing the riches of Virginia's waters. For foreign diplomats or dignitaries, it sent a message. America didn't need to import delicacies. It had its own treasures waiting in the tide. And these oysters weren't dainty appetizers. Guests might eat them by the dozen, slurping them straight from the shell, enjoying the salty bite that contrasted perfectly with heavier dishes like ham or beef. It was messy, communal, and yet still elegant in its own way. Fast forward to 2025, and oysters on the half-shell are a luxury item, often $2 to $3 each at a raw bar. Back then, they were abundant enough to feed entire taverns, yet prized enough to impress the finest guests. At Mount Vernon, oysters weren't just food, they were spectacle. Each shell cracked open at the table whispered a truth. America's abundance flowed not only from its fields, but also from its rivers and seas. 25. Broiled salt roe herring. To end the spread at Mount Vernon, Washington sometimes turned to the sea once more with broiled salt roe herring. Picture a salted, preserved herring roasted over open flame until its skin crackled, the roe inside rich and savory. Served hot, it had a bold, briny punch, the kind of flavor that might surprise modern palates, but was treasured in the 18th century. Herring was practical. Salted and preserved, it traveled well and lasted for months, making it a dependable staple in both humble kitchens and presidential estates. The roe, those tiny, flavorful eggs, added a richness that elevated the dish from common to refined. It wasn't delicate like oysters or fancy like blancmange, but it was hearty, filling, and honest. At Mount Vernon, broiled herring told guests something important. Washington's table wasn't built only on luxury. It included the foods that sustained households across the colonies. It was a nod to tradition, to resourcefulness, and to the kind of meals that built strength for both soldiers and statesmen. In 2025, herring isn't common in American kitchens, but you might find it in specialty markets, a whole salted fish costing around $8 to $12. Back then, it was cheap, reliable, and essential. So imagine it, a guest finishing a feast of roasted pig, iced cream, and chestnut-stuffed turkey, and then tasting the salty, smoky bite of herring. That contrast, humble yet bold, was the story of Mount Vernon's table, a balance of elegance and endurance, just like the nation Washington was building. When you step back and look at all 25 foods from Mount Vernon, you start to see a bigger story. This wasn't just George Washington feeding his family and guests. This was America on a plate. Roasted pig and Virginia ham spoke of abundance. Turkey with chestnut stuffing and iced cream showed off innovation and pride. Even the humble dishes, peas pudding, mutton chops, candied sweet potatoes, revealed a nation still tied to the land, making the most of every crop and creature. Washington's table wasn't only about taste, it was a statement. Every platter told guests, this new country can feed itself, impress the world, and honor both old traditions and new beginnings. The meals were hearty, symbolic, and sometimes surprising, but they all carried the same message: strength, hospitality, and identity. And maybe that's the real secret. The food at Mount Vernon wasn't just about satisfying hunger. It was about building trust, forging relationships, and showing that America had a place at the table of nations.